What if I told you that everything that you need to know about an Alteryx iterative macro is covered in this video? After watching this video, you will learn the ins and outs of an Alteryx iterative macro to successfully deploy a macro like that in a workflow that you're already building. If you haven't watched my video on batch macros, please go ahead and watch that, although you do not need a complete understanding of batch macros to understand what iterative macros are. Now, in my video on batch macros, I got a lot of comments on making this specific video on iterative macros. So you guys asked for it, and here it is. Let's discuss the concept of iterative macros first, and then we will talk about how to build it step by step. So very good way to understand iterative macros is to think about a while loop, okay? With iterative macros, what we are saying is in Alteryx, think of a specific condition, and till that condition is not satisfied, keep running the loop. Okay, so if you have used while loop in Python programming or any other programming languages, this is a very similar concept. I would say exactly the same concept in Alteryx. How it works, firstly, it executes a task. So do something until the condition is satisfied. Obviously, you'd have a specific condition. If that condition is satisfied, then your loop is going to end. If that condition is not satisfied, then the iteration is going to happen, okay? Which means that, okay, well, if you look at this specific diagram, it's checking for a condition, okay? If that condition is satisfied, it's going to stop the loop and give you the results. If the condition is not satisfied, it's going to keep on running the loop. So let's try to understand this, to really digest this. Let's try to understand this with a very simple example. Okay, so here we have this guy over here who is very excited to be having some money. Let's assume that he has $5,000 all in cash, and he wants to be a little bit smart about his investment. So what he's doing is he's running straight to a bank to deposit this $5,000. And his end goal is to get $5,800. So out of the total money that he has invested, the principal amount obviously is $5,000, and he wants to get $5,800 as total money that is sitting in his bank account. Okay. Now he goes to the bank, and the kind of deal that he gets is this interest rate is 8% per annum compounded quarterly. Okay. Now, how long will it take for this individual to have a total of $5,800 in his bank account? Okay, interesting question, right? It takes you back to sixth grade or seventh grade, wherein you learned the concept of simple interest and compound interest. Now, simple interest is very easy to calculate. The way compound interest is calculated is on a principal value, and then it gets compounded on each interval. Keep this in mind that this is 8%, okay, compounded quarterly. Okay, so this is a yearly interest that is compounded quarterly. Now, as you would know, a year has 4 quarters, right? So this would be 8%. So each quarter, this would be 2%. Okay, his investment is going to grow by 2%. So what you're going to do for the first quarter is take 102% of $5,000. Okay, and 102% of $5,000 is 5,100. For the second quarter, you're going to take 102% of $5,100, and that's going to be 5,202. And if we go back, our end goal is to make $5,800, right? So his question really is, how many quarters would it take to exceed this amount, right? So we're seeing over here that first quarter, 5,100, then 5,202, all the way to the eighth quarter, wherein the investment is exceeding $5,800, okay? So if you think about this concept using a while loop, right? Our end goal over here is to make 5,800. Okay. Now we would want this to be, we would want, if this was an Alteryx workflow, which we'd be making an Alteryx workflow for this step by step, we'd want that Alteryx workflow to keep on executing till we have got $5,800 as the total amount in the bank. Okay. So then this would execute 8 times. And on the 8th time is when our condition is met and our Alteryx workflow is going to stop and give us the results. So how do we do all of this in Alteryx? So same concept over here. This is the iterative macro that we'll be making step by step. Here I'm saying how much money are you trying to make? That's 5,800. What is the interest rate target? That's 8%. How much money have you invested? That's 5,000. And what is the frequency? That is quarterly. Okay. Now this is our macro. All the same values. Let's see if it tells us that it's going to take 8 quarters for this investment to result in a certain value. I'm going to go ahead and run this workflow. This workflow just ran, and over here it gives us the same value. Okay, so our money invested becomes 5,858, and it tells us that it would take 8 quarterly payments to make 5,858. Okay, so again, this whole iterative macro performed as a while loop, and it was able to calculate the same compound interest that we saw over here. And then when this condition was satisfied, then it was like, okay, well, this condition is satisfied. I need to stop running this Alteryx workflow, and I need to give the end result to my user and give the exact value. So this is what we have. Now let's try to make this step by step together. Okay, so let's start with a brand new Alteryx workflow with absolutely nothing on it. Here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop a text input on my canvas like that. And then over here, I am going to double click on the header, and then I'm going to call it money invested. Okay, now let's assume, as you would recall for our use case, we're investing $5,000 at 8% interest that is compounded quarterly, right? So here I have $5,000. Perfect. One of the first things that I'm going to do is convert this into a macro input. Okay, so for that, what I'm going to do is right click on the text input, and you're going to see that we have an option over here to convert it into a macro input. I'm going to click on that, and you're going to see that the text input right now is converted into a macro input. The next thing that I am going to do is I'm going to tell Alteryx that this is going to be an iterative macro workflow. So for that, I'm going to click anywhere on the white space on the canvas, and then I'm going to click on workflow. And you're going to see that right now, this is a standard macro. Okay. Now, when I click on this dropdown, you're going to see that I've got a standard macro, a batch macro, and an iterative macro. Now, if you want to know what batch macro is, again, I would very much encourage you to watch my step-by-step guide on batch macro. This one is specifically focused on iterative macro, so we wouldn't be talking about batch macro at all. So if you click on iterative macro over here, notice what happens when you click on iterative macro. Okay. All right, when I click on iterative macro, you're going to see that over here I've got an iteration number, and currently its value is 0. Okay, I'll be talking about what this iteration number is, but for now, let's just change the macro to an iterative macro. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on anywhere on the white space of my workflow. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I am going to add a formula tool, and this is where I'm going to do my compound interest calculation. What I'm going to do is this total amount of money that is invested, I am going to change this to a number. Okay. Why? Because eventually I want to create an app that allows me to dynamically change the total amount of money that I've invested. So eventually my end goal is I ask my user, what's the total amount of money that you've invested? And they provide me a value. I always want to make sure that that's a number. All of that is going to make sense here in a second. For now, let's just make sure that this is the data type for this is always a number. And I'm going to keep this calculation a little bit separate. I'm going to use another formula tool now. And then here I'm going to do all the calculations related to the compound interest calculations. Now, keep in mind that what we're trying to do is we're going to ask the user how much money you're trying to make, right? What is the interest, how much money that you've invested, okay? We'd always want to make sure, because we're going to be doing compound interest calculations inside our Alteryx workflow, we'd always want to make sure that these values that the user is entering, these are always numbers, okay? So then over here, I'm going to create another column, and this is going to be my interest calculation. And always make sure that this is a number value. And for now, for the purposes of our use case, if you remember, this was 8%. Okay, so let's give it a value of 8 right now. And if you remember, our Alteryx workflow also asks our end user, what is the interest rate, right? So we also want to make sure that this is always a number value. Next, I'm going to add another column, which is frequency. Okay. And for now, for our use case, this is quarterly. So I'm going to write quarterly. I'm going to write quarterly like that. Now this is a string value. That's why this is there in quotes. Now I'm going to create another value, which is time period. Now this time period, eventually we'd want whatever frequency that the user enters over here, we'd want that to be reflected in the formula that we'll be providing in our Alteryx workflow, okay? So really what we're trying to get to is the total time period, the total number of times we'd want this calculation to happen. So if you look at this, right, if this is quarter, there are 4 quarters in a year. So we'd want the value to be 4. If it's yearly, obviously the value to be 1. If it's monthly, we'd want the value to be, yep, you guessed it right. If it's monthly, we'd want this to be 12, right? So how do we do that? Based on whatever frequency that's there as a column value, we'd want the time period to be reflected. So this would be, just to save some time over here, this would be our calculation, okay? If the frequency is yearly, then 1. If it's quarterly, then 4 quarters in a year. If it's monthly, then 12. So now we want to calculate per time period, what would be the value, okay? So I'm going to calculate, I'm going to add another, which would be per your calculation. You can also say per time period calculation. Obviously, this gets changed based on what your time periods are, okay? So this would be 1 plus whatever the interest is divided by the time period, okay? And we'd want this calculation to happen first. And then if we follow PEMDAS, right? So then the division is going to happen and then 1 would be added to it. So similar to what we were doing over here, if you look back, right, how this value became 5,100 from 5,000, that was nothing but we multiplied 5,000 multiplied that by 1.02, or it took like 102% of 5,000, and that gave us 5,100 for one time period, right? Now, what would be the value at the end of the year? That would be 5,412.16. Why? Because this gets compounded every quarter, okay? So then we'd have to calculate what the value is going to be for this specific time period. So let's have another value, which is going to be our money invested. Our money invested would be into the per year calculation. Let's make sure that this is also a double. So if I multiply the total amount of money that I've invested into the per year calculation, that gives me 5,100, which is exactly the value that we got over here, right? So we'd want this to iterate as many number of times as possible till we get a value that is greater than 5,800. Okay, so then let me go ahead and run this workflow and let's see what we find. Okay, so this is what I found after running this workflow. The money invested is 5,100. So if we go back to what an iterative macro is, our condition over here is the amount greater than 5,800, which in this case, it's not, right? So let's have a simple filter logic over here. And then I'm going to say, test if the money invested is greater than 5,800. Okay. Now, it's not, right? If you've used the filter tool before, which I'm assuming that you have, the money invested is 5,100, and we're testing if it's greater than 5,800, right? So this is not true, which is the reason as to why we don't see any data over here. In the false anchor, you're going to see that we still have 5,100, and the per year calculation is 1.02. Now, this is where the concept of iterative macro comes in. Since our condition is not satisfied, we'd still want our iteration to run through. So this is not satisfied. What I'm going to do is I am going to search for a macro output. I'm going to connect my false anchor to this macro output. And this is going to be iterating, right? Since this condition is not satisfied, we want that whole macro to run again for this 5,100 to then be processed into the same workflow and get 5,202, right? And do you think the condition would be met the second time when the iteration happens? No, right? This is still less than 5,800, which is our condition over here, okay? So what we're going to do is for this specific macro output, I'm going to call this iteration, okay? And then once our condition is satisfied, then what happens, right? What do we want our workflow to return? So for that, I'm going to click on the true anchor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab another formula tool over here. And now if we go back, if you guys remember, when we made this as an iterative macro, one of the things that we got was this becomes an iterative macro, and now we've got an iteration number that starts from 0. Now this iteration number starts from 0, and we want to know how many times did this workflow actually run before our condition was satisfied, okay? So for that, we want to make sure that this iteration number is reflected as an output. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another column over here, and I'm going to call this number of time period. Now this iteration number starts from 0. I would be able to access this constant if I click on this X icon over here, columns and constants. This is the engine iteration number, and then I'm going to add 1 to it. Okay. So you're going to see, if I just run it like that, you're going to see right now, I don't see anything over here since our true condition is not satisfied, but there would be a time when our true condition would be satisfied. And we will see the total number of times that our macro had to iterate to get to that value. Now, we don't need everything that we have over here. So I'm going to grab a select tool over here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to deselect this per year calculation. We don't really need that. We do need money invested, interest, frequency, time period, and number of time periods. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and run this workflow. And now I also want to see if we go back to what we are trying to make, right? Our result tells us this is the kind of result that we're looking for. It would take 8 quarterly payments to make 5858, right? And it gives us the total amount of money that's invested. What's the interest? What's the frequency? The total time period, and the number of times it had to iterate to get to that value. Okay, so let's create this final result column, and then we'll be all done, I promise. Okay, so this is going to be the result value. And here I'm going to say, here we'll have to say this would take these many number of iterations running at this specific frequency to make this specific amount, right? So we want to make sure that since all of this is brought into the same column, we want to make sure that the data types are consistent for everything to be concatenated into a single sentence. Now let's make sure that I've added some space over here. So it would take this many number of time period. And let me make sure that there is space over here as well. Okay, there you go. Now, when I run this, I don't get anything, right? Because of course, like our condition is not satisfied. Now, this is where I add another macro output. And this is going to be my result. Now I'm going to add an abbreviation to it. This is going to be my result, and this is going to be my iteration. I would also have to specify what our results and iteration is going to be. We'll get that here in a second. But if you remember, the way we are trying to have this structured is in the tool itself, we have to ask these users questions, right? And whatever values that we have, we'd want those values to be dynamically changing, right? So for that, we will use interface tools over here real quick. Okay, so I'm going to be using a lot of text input interface tools. Okay, so go ahead and find your interface tools. Okay, the very first one is a text box. And here I'm going to say, how much money have you invested? Okay, now this is going to connect to my formula tool over here. Okay, now when you're going to connect it, you're going to see an action tool appears automatically. And here we have to specify what is this going to replace, right? So this is going to replace money invested. Okay, so I'm going to go to update values. Over here, I'm going to replace money invested over here. Okay, now here what we're trying to replace is, if you go back, this specific value, okay, with whatever the user is going to put in the text box. Now this would make sense as to why we are making sure that this is always a number, because whatever user is going to enter, that would be registered as a text value. I want to make sure that this gets registered as a number in our Alteryx workflow to make sure that all the calculations are happening. Okay, cool. Is asking the user about the interest. Okay, so here I'm going to have another one. What is the interest rate target? Okay, and then this is also going to connect to this formula tool. Okay, now update value, this action tool should appear automatically. And here I'd have to specify what exactly it's replacing, right? So I've got all my formulas over here. What this is going to replace is obviously this interest value. So I'm going to expand that. And then it's going to replace the actual interest value, just to number over here. So I'm going to select that. Now, if you remember, we're also going to ask our end user how this calculation is going to happen. Okay, so we're going to have a text box over here. And then here, I'm going to ask the question, what is the frequency? And here they have an option to choose between yearly, quarterly, and monthly, right? So here I'm going to say yearly, quarterly, monthly. Okay, and then this is also going to replace the quarterly value over here. So if you look at frequency right now, the expression value is quarterly. I'm going to click on that. Okay. And then this is going to replace my quarterly value over here. Last thing is how much money you're trying to make, right? Which is this default value over here. Right now it says 5,800, but this would change depending upon, how much money we have invested, whatever the interest rate is, and whatever our target amount is. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in another text box over here, and then I am going to connect this to this filter, and this is going to update the operand value, which is 5,800. Okay. And then here I'm going to ask the user, how much money are you trying to make? Okay. All right. This is 99% done. Now, the only thing that we need over here is to tell Alteryx what is going to be our iteration and what is going to be the value on which the iteration is going to happen. Okay. So for that, if you remember my batch macro video, all of those settings, they live in Interface Designer. I'm going to click on View and Interface Designer. And this is what our macro looks like, right? So these are all the nicely configured fields that we have. How much money have you invested? What is the interest target rate? What is the frequency? How much money you're trying to make? If I click on this little gear sign, this is going to show you the properties of your iterative macro. Now, something that you're going to be seeing differently from the batch macro series is over here, I've got an iteration input and iteration output and maximum number of iterations. I also have the ability to specify what is going to happen when the maximum number of iterations are hit. And obviously, like I can customize my macro, change the icon of this, or also get a custom icon and have that as the image of my macro. So for this, I'm going to click on standard icon, and I'm going to change this to this little red tool over here. My iteration input is going to be input 1, which was my text input, if you guys remember. And then the iteration output is going to be this little I macro, right? If you go back every single time if we go back every single time this iterates, if you guys remember, right? So 5,100, then iterates to 5,202. So my iteration output is going to be this iteration result if my condition is not satisfied. Okay, now that is it. I'm going to click on these three dots and then hide. And then I'm going to save this as a compound interest calculator macro. I'm going to go ahead and click on save. I've opened a brand new Alteryx workflow. I'm going to find my macro again. So right-click macro, browse, and then I'm going to find my macro, have it here on the canvas. And then, so this is my macro. And here I'm specifying the amount of money that I'm trying to make is 5,800. Interest target is 8. The money that I've invested is 5,000. And the frequency of this is quarterly. Okay. Now, when I run this, let's see what I find. Okay. So you're going to see over here. And if you don't get these messages, what I've done is I click on this white space over here, go to runtime, and then I'm showing all the macro messages. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and hit the run button over here again. And you're going to see that for each of the iteration, 0 records were true, 1 were false. So the iteration was run again, right? For the second one as well, the same thing happened until the 7th iteration, okay? Well, actually till the 8th iteration where 1 record was true, so our condition was satisfied, right? If you go back to the whole concept of iteration macro, it keeps on iterating till the condition is satisfied, okay? So 7 iterations on total were ran. And then we finally get this result. If I click on this R anchor, this is where we get the result value. Okay, so the total amount of money that we've invested is 5. It becomes 5858 over here, which is this value that is greater than 5,800. And it tells us that it would take 8 quarterly payments to make 5858, which is 8 quarterly payments is 2 years to get to this specific final value. All right, well, that is all we got for today's video. I hope this concept of iterative macro made sense. All right, well, that's all we got for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please make sure that you subscribe to my channel. It is free of cost and it really helps me with the algorithm. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. I read every single comment and I respond to every single comment. Until next time, thank you so much for watching Analytics with Div.